Imagine stepping into a world where the night is not your friend, where the stars cannot pierce the canopy above you, and where silence does not comfort, but instead makes your pulse race, because silence in the forest means that something or someone is listening, waiting, calculating. In the Middle Ages, when the sun sank behind the hills, stepping into a forest was not just a test of courage, it was a gamble with your life. And unlike the neat and curated parks of today, medieval forests were living, breathing labyrinths of fear, law, and superstition. People did not think of them as peaceful escapes or romantic retreats. They were boundaries between safety and the unknown, thresholds that most entered only when they had no choice, because every shadow held the potential of death, every crunch of a branch could herald bandits, predators, or worse, forces they could not see and dared not name. And yet, beyond the natural dangers of wild animals, cold, and hunger, the medieval mind layered these spaces with laws harsher than any courtroom, with legends darker than any nightmare, and with realities that made the forest less a place of nature and more a hostile state within a state. Today we go hiking with backpacks, bottled water, and GPS systems. Yet even with all our equipment, modern hikers still get lost, still panic, still make fatal mistakes. So imagine what it meant to walk into those same woods with nothing but your clothes, a rough sack, maybe a walking stick, and no sense of direction beyond the sun and stars which the trees often hid. To grasp the terror fully, we need to shed our modern comfort and see the forest as they did, not as a place of wonder, but as an active threat, a stage where kings, criminals, demons, and hunger all had equal claim. And that's where our story begins, not with romance under the branches, but with the suffocating awareness that entering a medieval forest after dark was like signing your own death warrant. Because the question was never whether danger existed there, but only which one would find you first. And in this first chapter, we are going to set the stage for a journey into the nightmare that was Europe's woodlands, where law and lawlessness coexisted, where survival hinged on impossible decisions, and where the forest itself seemed to conspire against human life. And by the end of this series, you will not only understand why peasants whispered about the woods, but also why stepping past the tree line was considered one of the most foolish acts a person could commit in the Middle Ages. If you thought wolves or bears were the worst things waiting for you in the forest, you would be mistaken. Because the greatest predator in the medieval woods was not a beast, but the crown itself. And royal forests were not simply woodlands, but entire kingdoms within kingdoms, governed by their own merciless rules that made even the bravest peasant tremble. For these were not hunting preserves in the way we think of game reserves today, but legal minefields, where survival was not measured by claws and fangs, but by whether you stepped on the wrong branch, picked the wrong berry, or so much as looked at a deer that the king had claimed as his own. Imagine an invisible fence surrounding vast swathes of land, yet no signs, no borders, no warnings, just an arbitrary line known to locals but invisible to outsiders. And the moment you crossed it, you stopped being a free subject and became a criminal, judged not by fairness, but by laws designed to favor one man, and one man alone, the monarch. In these royal forests, punishment was not about intent. It was about existence. And something as small as gathering fallen wood to cook your dinner could be interpreted as theft from the king's property, punishable by crippling fines, mutilation, or even death. Which meant that peasants who already struggled to survive often faced the horrifying paradox of choosing between freezing in their huts during winter, or risking execution by foraging in lands that had once been common to all but were now restricted to royal use. These laws were enforced by wardens and rangers who had nearly absolute power, men who patrolled with authority backed by the throne. And unlike modern park rangers who hand out pamphlets and safety advice, these medieval counterparts had the legal right to drag you before a forest court, or even kill you outright if they suspected you of poaching. And suspicion was enough, because guilt was assumed, innocence was irrelevant, and mercy was a luxury no one could expect. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of parking enforcement officers, except instead of a ticket on your windshield, you got a rope around your neck. And once you were caught, the system that judged you moved swiftly and without compassion, because forest courts were less about justice and more about deterrence, operating like a conveyor belt of punishment that reminded the population, again and again, these lands belonged not to the people but to the crown. This turned forests from potential refuges into arenas of fear where the law itself became another predator to avoid. And the irony is striking, because while peasants feared wolves and bears, they feared wardens even more, since a wild animal might leave you alone, but a man with authority had no such hesitation. And the worst part was that travelers, unfamiliar with local boundaries, could wander unknowingly into these forbidden woods, desperate for shelter, unaware that each step brought them closer to a death sentence, only to learn too late that ignorance was no defense, that in the eyes of the crown they had committed a capital crime. In modern times, we worry about trespassing signs, about fences, about property lines, but in the Middle Ages there were none. Only invisible borders policed by men eager to show their loyalty by enforcing the harshest penalties, and so the very land itself became a trap, turning survival into a legal puzzle that no stranger could solve. This meant the forest was not just a natural danger zone, but a political one, a space where the rule of law turned predatory and where the system ensured that ordinary people had less to fear from wolves than from kings. And it is here, in this strange and terrifying legal landscape, that the medieval forest ceases to be a neutral setting and becomes instead an arena of power, a tool of control, and a reminder that danger wears many faces, some dressed in fur and teeth, others dressed in royal insignia and carrying writs of execution, and for the common man or woman, the difference did not matter, because both could end your life just as easily. But if the crown's laws made the forest a political prison, the human predators who lived within made it something far worse, because unlike wardens who operated in daylight with the backing of authority, bandits and outlaws thrived in the shadows, unbound by law and unrestrained by mercy, and in many ways they were the true lords of the woods, ruling with violence, terror, and a kind of twisted efficiency that turned the medieval forest into a no-go zone for anyone who valued their life. Imagine walking along a narrow path, clutching what little belongings you had, maybe a pouch of coins or food, only to feel the weight of unseen eyes watching from the treetops, because many of these gangs used scouts who climbed high above the canopy, posted in trees like grotesque sentinels, their sharp eyes trained to spot travelers from miles away, and when they saw someone approaching, they used horn blasts, bird calls, or smoke signals to summon their comrades, transforming what seemed like an innocent walk into the prelude to an ambush. Their methods were as clever as they were cruel, with some gangs placing fake signs along trails pointing toward phantom villages or promising shortcuts, but in reality guiding travelers straight into choke points where the attackers were waiting, and others strung ropes low across pathways to trip horses, sending riders crashing to the ground. or dug pits camouflaged with branches that swallowed both man and beast in one instant of horror, so that what appeared to be a simple journey became an elaborate death trap engineered by desperate men who had nothing left to lose. And unlike modern thieves who might take your wallet and flee, these bandits rarely left survivors because a living witness was a risk. So robbery almost always escalated into torture, assault, and murder, their cruelty not incidental but deliberate. A performance of power meant to terrify future travelers into submission. Imagine trying to negotiate with men who saw you not as a fellow human but as prey, who knew the terrain better than any soldier and who had spent years perfecting the art of making the woods work in their favor, turning every tree, every hill, every clearing into a weapon. Local authorities, with their soldiers and patrols, often had no ability to stop them, because how do you catch shadows that melt into the undergrowth? How do you chase men who vanish into thickets that only they know, and so entire stretches of forest roads became infamous as killing zones, whispered about in villages but never marked on maps? For no one wanted to publicly admit how powerless the law was against such gangs. These weren't isolated incidents, but enduring realities, for some forest territories remained under bandit control for decades, creating permanent scars on the geography of Europe, invisible lines that seasoned travelers knew to avoid at all costs, while newcomers stumbled into them with fatal ignorance. If the royal forest had been an oppressive cage, these outlaw-controlled woods were open-air slaughterhouses, and the irony was sharp. One section of forest punished you for taking a branch, another punished you simply for existing at the wrong place at the wrong time, and together they created an environment where safety was an illusion. In modern terms, we can think of it like traveling down a dark highway in a region controlled by cartels, where the police dare not enter and where every turn could lead to an unmarked grave. Except in the medieval forest, there were no phones, no vehicles, no quick rescues, only your feet and the rising panic in your chest as you realized too late that the birds you heard calling were not birds at all, but signals for men waiting with knives. And the cruelest twist of all was that these outlaws were not monsters from myths, but people. Former soldiers, deserters, runaway serfs, escaped criminals, men who had been broken by the very systems meant to control them and who now used the forest as both shield and weapon, carving out kingdoms of terror in the very places where the desperate poor once sought refuge, reminding us that sometimes the most dangerous predator of all is not the wolf at the edge of the firelight, but the man who has decided that survival is easier when he no longer respects the lives of others. So you've made it past the wardens and escaped the traps of bandits. But the medieval forest is not done with you, because now the greatest danger comes not from men, but from the elements themselves. And at the center of survival was one paradox that every traveler knew: fire was both your only friend and your most dangerous enemy. Without fire, you would freeze, be swallowed by darkness, and become easy prey for beasts. Yet with fire, you risked discovery, punishment, or even triggering disasters that destroyed more than just yourself. Think about it. In a world without matches or lighters, starting a fire meant carrying flint and steel and knowing how to coax sparks into flame. And that skill alone could mean the difference between living until dawn or not. But forests were wet, damp, and heavy with moisture, so dry tinder was scarce. And one mistake could cost you hours of effort you didn't have while predators circled unseen. Imagine striking steel against flint, sparks flying like brief stars before dying against damp bark, your heart pounding as you tried again and again, every failure making the night feel thicker and the sounds around you louder until panic crept in, because you knew that without fire the night would not forgive you. But even success brought its own terror, because smoke rose like a beacon visible for miles, announcing your presence to bandits who could follow it like a trail, or to forest wardens who would see your fire as proof of trespass and theft. And, unlike wild animals, these men did not need hunger to motivate them, only opportunity. Worse still, a careless spark in dry seasons could ignite a blaze that consumed not just your camp but thousands of acres. Because medieval people had no hoses, no fire brigades, no means to stop an inferno once it began, and so a single ember, carried on the wind, could turn your survival strategy into your executioner, a walking wall of flame advancing faster than you could flee. And yet the alternative was just as bleak, for without fire you had no warmth, no way to cook food, no defense against predators whose instinct told them that darkness meant advantage. And so you faced a cruel dilemma every night: do you risk the dangers of light or embrace the dangers of darkness? Survival manuals today preach redundancy, preparation, backups, but medieval travelers had none of this. No magnesium sticks, no waterproof matches, no flashlights, just one small spark, and a hope that nature would permit it, and if that spark died, so might you. But fire was not just about heat, it was about psychology, because the human mind collapses quickly without comfort, and staring into darkness for hours without light was a form of torture in itself, where every snap of a twig jolted your nerves, and every howl convinced you that teeth were closing in. So people craved the circle of firelight not only to see but to feel human, to push back against the crushing weight of wilderness. In many ways, fire was a fragile fortress, a flickering border between civilization and chaos. But, unlike stone walls, it required constant feeding, which meant leaving your fragile circle of safety to gather more wood, venturing deeper into the dark, each step a gamble with predators or traps, so that every piece of fuel came at a price. And this constant maintenance wore down the body and mind until exhaustion made mistakes inevitable. Modern campers complain about damp logs or smoke in their eyes, but in the Middle Ages, failure with fire was a death sentence, and success was often just a slower form of dying, because the more you relied on it, the more visible you became, until the forest itself seemed to whisper, "Light your fire and I will come for you." In truth, the medieval forest punished both caution and recklessness, forcing travelers into an impossible choice. And that is what made it so terrifying, because survival there was not just about skill, it was about luck, and luck was the one resource you could not pack into your satchel before stepping into the trees. If the forest at night already felt like a predator, then war turned it into a battlefield that never slept, because medieval armies did not fight only on open fields with banners waving and horns sounding. They fought in the trees, among the shadows, where surprise mattered more than honor, and where the forest itself became a weapon. Imagine marching with your lord's men through thick woodland, the branches clawing at your armor, the mud sucking at your boots, your eyes darting to every movement. And then, without warning, a volley of arrows rains down from the darkness. The enemy, invisible yet deadly, using the cover of trees as shields. And before you can raise your sword, half your companions are on the ground, bleeding into the soil. Forests were perfect for ambushes, perfect for hiding troop movements, and perfect for traps, and medieval engineers made sure to take full advantage, digging pits lined with sharpened stakes and covering them with leaves, setting snares that caught ankles and necks alike, and erecting hidden barriers that funneled soldiers into kill zones where they were slaughtered before they even knew what had happened. For ordinary travelers, stumbling into one of these abandoned battlefields was as deadly as the original war itself, because the traps did not vanish when the armies marched away. They lingered like ghosts, waiting for the unlucky, and centuries of conflict meant that entire regions of Europe's forests were littered with remnants of war, broken weapons, rotting armor, skeletal remains, all grim reminders that the trees were not just habitats for birds, but archives of violence. And there was another danger to men who refused to leave. Soldiers who deserted, or rebels who made the woods their permanent strongholds. Fortified camps hidden deep in valleys or marshes where they could strike nearby villages for supplies, taking prisoners, killing informants, and seeing every stranger as either a spy or a hostage. Think of them as medieval guerrilla cells, armed, ruthless, and convinced that the forest made them untouchable, and in many ways it did, because even professional armies hesitated to pursue them into dense thickets where visibility dropped. Communication broke down, an ambush could come from every side. To the authorities, these bands were a cancer, yet to the locals they were a nightmare that could not be excised, because no amount of loyalty to king or church protected you when armed men crept from the trees demanding food, coin, or your children as leverage. War in the forest was unlike war anywhere else, because here you could not always tell friend from foe, soldier from outlaw, or spy from traveler, and even a chance conversation with a stranger could doom your entire village if he turned out to be an enemy scout mapping defenses. Loose words by a campfire could bring raiders the next week. And so medieval people learned silence, suspicion, and avoidance, preferring to risk hunger at home than cross paths with men who saw them as pawns in a war they did not start. The psychological toll was immense, because the forest was no longer just a place of wolves or laws. It was an extension of human conflict, a chessboard on which ordinary people were the expendable pieces. And this made every journey not just a survival challenge, but a political gamble, where even your presence in the woods could be misinterpreted as evidence of treason. The forest, then, was not neutral ground but hostile territory, one that remembered every battle, every ambush, every scream, and carried those memories in pits, bones, and scars on the landscape that warned the wise. This is not your home. It is someone else's battlefield, and you are not welcome. If warfare turned the medieval forest into a battlefield, hunger and thirst turned it into a slow-moving executioner, because even if you avoided wardens, bandits, and soldiers, your body itself would eventually betray you in the absence of safe food and water. And here the forest was far less generous than modern imaginations like to believe. We think of forests as abundant pantries full of berries, mushrooms, and game. But the truth is that most of what grew in medieval woodlands was either toxic, scarce, or impossible to prepare safely without knowledge passed down through generations. And to make matters worse, traveling by night or in hiding meant you often searched in near-total darkness, which turned every bite into a gamble between nourishment and poison. Picture a weary traveler kneeling at the base of a tree, plucking leaves that look harmless, unaware that they contain toxins which, without careful soaking or cooking, would kill within hours. And the cruel part is that edible and poisonous plants often looked almost identical, so even the experienced could make fatal mistakes. Mushrooms were perhaps the worst of all delicious when safe, deadly when not, and medieval people whispered of families who ate the wrong fungus and vanished from history overnight. Modern foragers with field guides, flashlights, and internet resources still poison themselves. So imagine the margin for error when your only light was a smoldering ember and your only guide was superstition. Hunting was no safer, because small animals in the forest had every advantage. Sharper hearing, better night vision, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and escape routes no human could follow. And unless you carried a bow, snares, or most desperate travelers did not. Two had no chance of catching them. Trying to wrestle a rabbit with your bare hands was as absurd as trying to catch smoke. And larger animals, like boars or deer, would not feed you, they would kill you. Hunger quickly turned from discomfort to madness, and though the human body can technically survive 3 weeks without food, medieval accounts suggest that the mental effects began almost immediately: poor judgment, reckless choices, hallucinations, and a dangerous willingness to eat anything, no matter how suspicious. It was said that starving men became like broken compasses, pointing not north or south but toward whatever would silence their stomachs, and that desperation often ended in tragedy when poisonous plants or spoiled carcasses were consumed. Thirst was even deadlier, for while hunger gnawed slowly, dehydration struck like a hammer, and within 3 or 4 days without water a human body collapses. Yet medieval streams, clear and sparkling as they looked, were cesspools of parasites, bacteria, and animal waste. To drink untreated water was to invite fever, vomiting, and diarrhea, a cycle that dehydrated you faster than the thirst you were trying to cure. And without modern medicine, that spiral almost always ended in death. The knowledge that water had to be boiled existed, but that required containers, steady fire, and time luxuries no fugitive or lost traveler possessed. And so the forest mocked you with abundance that you dared not touch, streams you dared not drink, berries you dared not eat. Imagine kneeling at a brook, lips cracked, hands trembling, and staring at the water, knowing that drinking it might kill you, but not drinking it would certainly kill you. A cruel dilemma that stripped survival down to a wager against fate. Even worse, as hunger and thirst worsened, judgment vanished, panic replaced reason, and travelers often made catastrophic errors, wandering farther from safety in frantic circles, collapsing deeper into the forest's grasp. Medieval people feared wolves and demons, but the real terror came from within, from their own desperate brains, tricked by starvation into consuming death disguised as dinner. And this is why the forest was more than a landscape, it was a gauntlet of impossible decisions, every choice laced with risk, every action carrying consequences that pushed you closer to ruin, until even the strongest-willed began to understand that sometimes the greatest danger in the woods was not the predator you could see, but the weakness gnawing at your own stomach and the thirst cracking your tongue. But as deadly as hunger and thirst were, they were at least physical threats you could understand, measure, and perhaps fight against, whereas the supernatural terrors of the medieval forest were far more insidious, because they lived not in the trees themselves, but in the human imagination. An imagination in those centuries was shaped by a worldview where demons and witches were as real as wolves, where the unseen was always more dangerous than the visible, and where the church reminded you constantly that the forest was not only a place to lose your body, but also your soul. Medieval Europe carried within its forests echoes of the old pagan world, with sacred groves, fertility rites, and seasonal ceremonies that predated Christianity. And though the church worked to stamp them out, people whispered that such practices never fully disappeared, only retreated deeper into the trees where torches did not shine. Villagers told stories of witches gathering under the cover of night, performing Sabbaths where they danced with demons, offered sacrifices, and plotted misfortune against Christian communities. And whether these events truly happened mattered less than the fact that everyone believed they did, because belief itself carried power. Enough that even the bravest avoided certain clearings after dusk. Strange markings carved into bark, cryptic symbols scratched into stones, or even simple trailside carvings could terrify travelers who saw them as proof of witchcraft. And while we might today dismiss them as innocent graffiti, a medieval mind read them as signatures of the devil, invitations to corruption, or warnings that you had stumbled into cursed ground. Church sermons fueled these fears, teaching that to witness a demonic gathering was to risk your eternal salvation, and that even accidental involvement with witches could brand you as their collaborator, leading to suspicion, trial, and death. Imagine walking a dark path, hearing laughter carried by the wind, catching the glow of fire between the trees, and not knowing whether you were about to stumble upon a group of travelers like yourself, a secret gathering that could damn you forever. Worse still, if you survived such an encounter and told others, your testimony might not save you but condemn you, because the mere act of describing witchcraft was often enough to be accused of partaking in it, and under torture almost anyone confessed, weaving the forest even deeper into Europe's web of paranoia. In this way, superstition made the woods more frightening than wolves or hunger, because at least those threats ended your earthly life, but the demonic threat promised to destroy your eternal soul, and to medieval people, that was a punishment worse than death. We see here the collision of religion, folklore, and raw fear creating a psychological landscape in which the forest was not simply dangerous terrain but an active spiritual battlefield where heaven and hell both claimed territory, and where a misstep into the wrong glade could make you a casualty in a war you could not see. The terror was compounded by uncertainty. Perhaps the strange symbols were nothing more than wayfinders carved by travelers. Perhaps the flickering light in the clearing was just another desperate family making camp, but the risk of being wrong was too great, and so people avoided the woods at night entirely, preferring hunger, cold, and wolves to the risk of encountering witches, demons, or pagan rituals, for those could not only kill the body but stain the soul forever. And in that choice we glimpse the medieval mindset, where faith and fear braided together, where salvation was as fragile as a candle flame, and where the forest was not merely an enemy of the flesh but a threat to eternity itself. And yet even witches, demons, and pagan whispers paled in comparison to the most universal fear of all, becoming utterly lost, because the medieval forest was not simply a patch of trees but an ocean of green, stretching for miles upon miles, with no signposts, no maps, no compasses, and no clear way out once you strayed from the main path. Today we talk about getting lost in national parks, and even with GPS, hikers vanish for days or weeks. But in the Middle Ages, when navigation tools were almost non-existent, the forest was a labyrinth designed to disorient, to spin you in circles until you collapsed from exhaustion, and every step away from a known trail was a step deeper into what was essentially a death sentence. European forests were massive, covering vast portions of the land before farming carved them into smaller pieces, and without cultivated fields or open roads to guide you. Every direction looked the same, trunks rising like endless pillars, canopy, blotting out the sun and undergrowth that obscured your sense of distance. Navigation depended on natural cues like stars or the position of the sun, but in dense woods those cues vanished. leaving travelers guessing whether they were walking forward or simply looping endlessly. People tried to create their own system, cloth two branches, carving notches into trees, laying down stones like breadcrumbs, but weather erased them, strangers moved them, or time rotted them away. So returning along the same route was far from guaranteed. It was said that the forest had a way of folding in on itself, tricking even the most experienced woodsman into thinking they were making progress when they were merely circling back to the same fallen log, the same crooked oak, the same stream they had crossed hours earlier. And if getting lost was physically dangerous, it was psychologically devastating, because panic arrived quickly, stealing reason and replacing it with desperation, and desperate people made foolish instead of pacing themselves, shouting until their voices gave out, or plunging deeper into thickets where escape became impossible. Imagine the crushing realization as night fell that you had no idea where you were, that the village you left was gone, that no one was looking for you because no one even knew which direction you had wandered, and that the only company you had was the rising chorus of nocturnal sounds growing louder as your courage shrank. In such moments, the human mind began to unravel, and fear itself became another predator, whispering lies, convincing you that salvation was just beyond the next grove, luring you farther away from safety until you collapsed, spent with nothing left to guide you but hopelessness. Being lost was not just a matter of direction, it was a stripping away of identity, because in the forest you were no longer a farmer, a pilgrim, or a knight. You were just another body among thousands that had already vanished into the trees, unmarked and unremembered. This is why medieval people told cautionary tales about those who wandered too far, why they tied stories of witches and spirits to certain paths. Because beyond the moral warnings lay a simple truth: the forest was vast, indifferent, and merciless, and if you let it swallow you, no prayer, no law, and no bravery could bring you back. And as if the terrors of being lost weren't enough, night brought its own fresh hell, because at some point the body demanded rest. Yet in the medieval forest, sleep was not relief, but another form of danger. Almost as if the woods themselves conspired to punish anyone who dared close their eyes. Imagine lying down on damp ground with no tent, no blanket, nothing but your clothes, the soil beneath you cold and uneven, the air heavy with moisture that clung to your skin until every joint ached, and the forest floor alive with movement. Insects crawling across your body, mosquitoes whining in your ears, fleas and ticks burrowing into your skin, all feeding on you as though you were the banquet. Even if the biting didn't wake you, the itching would, and infection from those tiny punctures was a slow, painful risk you couldn't avoid. Because there was no soap, no ointment, no reprieve, just the knowledge that every minute of exposure was another invitation to disease. Worse still, the night was never silent, for forests never sleep, branches crack, leaves rustle, owls shriek, wolves howl, and each sound, however small, jolted the exhausted mind awake with one thought: something is coming. And sometimes something was, because predators were curious, drawn to human scent. 2 food scraps, 2 warmth, and a sleeping human was easy to sniff, paw, or even bite. Not out of hunger, but to test whether you were prey or a rival, and waking to the wet breath of an animal inches from your face was a horror many never survived. Those who tried to keep fires burning found little peace, for every trip to gather fuel meant leaving the fragile circle of light and risking getting lost or ambushed. And even with flames crackling, rest was shallow, broken by fear that the fire would die, that smoke would betray your location, or that sparks would ignite the very forest meant to shield you. Sleep deprivation soon followed, gnawing away at judgment, reaction time, and sanity, until even the strongest-willed became clumsy, paranoid, and reckless, their minds unraveling under the weight of exhaustion. Some desperate travelers tied themselves to tree trunks, hoping that if they passed out, they wouldn't wander or roll into danger. But even that was no guarantee. 4 ropes did not stop dreams from turning to nightmares, jolting the body awake in panic, heart pounding, breath ragged, as the brain conjured images of the very threats lurking just beyond sight. Think of it as a medieval form of psychological warfare. Every night the forest broke you down a little more, turning your body weak, your thoughts clouded, and your courage thin, until survival was no longer about strength or skill, but about sheer stubbornness to keep moving through fatigue. In the end, the forest didn't need wolves, bandits, or demons to kill you, because sleeplessness itself was enough, a slow suffocation of mind and spirit that left you unable to resist whatever final danger found you. And this was the cruelest truth of all, that the forest was not just a physical place of trees and shadows, but a relentless enemy that attacked on every front body, mind, and soul, till you understood why so many medieval people saw it not as nature, but as death, given form. By now, the picture is clear. The medieval forest was not a backdrop for fairy tales or a romantic landscape of knights and maidens wandering under green boughs. It was an ecosystem of fear, a total environment where every element, law, hunger, superstition, wildlife, exhaustion, and human cruelty worked together to crush anyone foolish or desperate enough to step inside. And this is what makes the forest such a fascinating symbol in history, because it wasn't just geography, it was psychology, a living reminder that survival depended less on bravery and more on calculation, luck, and respect for forces beyond your control. Royal laws made the forest a legal trap where your life could be taken for breaking a branch. Bandits and deserters turned it into a theater of violence where ambushes and torture were routine. Wars and guerrilla fighters scarred it with traps and bones that lingered long after the battles ended. Hunger and thirst transformed every stream and plant into a gamble between relief and poison. Superstition and religion layered it with demons, witches, and eternal damnation. Disorientation stripped travelers of reason and left them wandering in maddening circles, and sleepless nights eroded body and mind until collapse was inevitable. Each of these dangers alone would have been enough to terrify, but together they created a place so hostile that it became more than landscape. It became legend, woven into stories as dark forests that swallowed heroes whole, as cursed realms where monsters dwelled, as liminal spaces where civilization ended and chaos began. And even though we today think we have tamed nature with GPS, headlamps, and survival kits, echoes of that fear remain. For every time a modern hiker gets lost in the wilderness, every time a camper feels eyes in the dark, every time we hear a story of someone vanishing in the woods, never to be found, we brush against the same primal terror that medieval people lived with every day. Perhaps that is why forests continue to haunt our imagination in literature and film, why they serve as settings for horror and mystery. Because somewhere deep inside we still understand that these spaces are not ours, that they belong to themselves, and that stepping into them is always, at some level, an act of risk. And that risk is what shaped the medieval world's relationship with the forest, not as a place of beauty but as a crucible of fear, where survival was never guaranteed and where the trees themselves seemed to conspire with law, man, and myth, to remind you of your own fragility. The lesson here is not that medieval people were weak or superstitious, but that they were honest about the reality they faced, that life at the edge of survival requires humility, caution, and constant awareness that nature and human cruelty alike can devour you when you least expect it. And perhaps that's why the forest became a cultural metaphor for the unknown, for danger, for the trial that every soul must walk through, because beyond the tree line lay not comfort or escape, but the very essence of risk itself. To understand why the medieval forest still haunts our imagination, we need to see it not only as a physical danger, but also as a cultural symbol. Because when medieval people told stories about forests, they were not only describing trees and paths, but encoding the fears, laws, and traumas that shaped their daily existence. This is why so many European folk tales begin with a warning: do not go into the woods, because the forest represented everything outside the fragile circle of civilization, and within that boundary, safety dissolved into uncertainty, rules bent into cruelty, and survival became a negotiation with forces that cared nothing for human lives. In fact, if you strip away the magical embellishments of fairy tales, what you find is history in disguise. The witch's hut in the deep forest, a reminder of strangers accused of pagan practices who lived in isolation beyond the village. The band of robbers who waylay a wandering prince, echoes of the outlaws and deserters who turned travel into gambling with death, enchanted streams or poisoned springs, metaphors for the very real danger of drinking untreated water, and the hero who wanders lost among trees for days until he nearly perishes, a narrative pulled straight from countless true stories of those who vanished forever. The forest was more than backdrop. It was stage and character, adversary and executioner, the place where the ordinary rules of human society no longer applied. And so when the church preached that these woods were also realms of the devil, people listened because the evidence of cruelty, lawlessness, and despair was already undeniable. Fast forward to today, and forests retain this aura of the unknown even though our relationship has changed. We hike them for pleasure. We camp to find solitude. We marvel at their beauty. But beneath that admiration lingers the unease that these places remain indifferent to us. That if we strip away our tools and comforts, the same dangers medieval people faced still stalk us in silence. Modern survival accounts prove this, when hikers disappear despite carrying GPS, when campers panic after losing a trail, when whole search teams comb through miles of trees and never find a body. And suddenly the medieval voice whispering "don't go into the woods" sounds less like superstition and more like timeless wisdom. What medieval people understood, and what we too often forget, that the forest does not care about human courage or innocence. It does not bend to justice or mercy. It simply exists. Vast, unyielding, and dangerous, and that reality can overwhelm even the most prepared. So, when peasants told their children that the forest was cursed, when knights feared ambush in its depths, when villagers whispered about witches in the glades, they were not simply inventing legends, but preserving survival lessons. Be cautious, be respectful, and understand that beyond the tree line lies not a playground, but a trial, a crucible that tests every weakness. Perhaps this is why the forest endures in our collective storytelling, because it is the perfect metaphor for the unknown challenges that lie ahead of us. A reminder that leaving the light of the familiar always comes with risk, and that survival in hostile places requires more than bravery. It requires humility and wisdom. And that is the thread that connects us to our medieval ancestors, the same primal awareness that in certain places, darkness is not absence, but presence, and the forest is never empty, it is always watching. Fear of the forest did not vanish with the Middle Ages, simply changed costume, because while medieval people spoke of witches, demons, and wardens, modern people whisper about serial killers, cryptids, and hikers who vanish without a trace. Yet the underlying psychology is exactly the same. The forest is an environment that magnifies human vulnerability, strips away the comforts of society, and forces us to confront the terrifying truth that we are small, fragile, and profoundly unprepared once our tools are gone. Psychologists today understand that being lost in the wilderness triggers a sequence of mental breakdowns almost identical to what medieval chroniclers described. Panic sets in when we lose orientation. Rational thinking dissolves under the pressure of fear, and the brain begins to interpret every sound, every movement as a threat, a survival instinct once useful but now often fatal. This is why people run when they should stay put, why they drink contaminated water though they know it may kill them, why they walk in circles convinced they are making progress, and why sleep deprivation drives them toward delusion, hearing voices, seeing shapes in the shadows, much like their medieval counterparts who swore they saw demons in the trees. What they were experiencing, and what we still experience, is the brain manufacturing explanations for danger it cannot understand, and the forest with its endless repetition of shapes, its silence punctuated by sudden noises, its sheer indifference becomes the perfect canvas for those fears. This is also why forests dominate horror fiction and cinema, from fairy tales like Hansel and Gretel to modern films like The Blair Witch Project or The Ritual. Storytellers consistently use forests as backdrops for terror because audiences instinctively recognize the setting as hostile, unpredictable, and isolating. And notice the themes: children lost among trees, groups being hunted by something unseen, strange symbols carved into wood, the failure of firelight to protect all echoes of the medieval anxieties that shaped our cultural DNA. Survival instructors today still preach the basics that medieval people lived by: conserve energy, find safe water, respect the dangers of fire, and never underestimate fatigue. Yet even with knowledge, accidents happen, proving that the medieval terror was not superstition, but recognition of a reality that still holds true. Perhaps the biggest difference is that we disguise our fear now in thrill-seeking hiking, camping, survival challenges, but at the core we are replaying ancient rituals, testing ourselves against the same environment our ancestors saw as death's territory. This continuity is remarkable because it shows that while technology may evolve, our biology does not, and the forest still speaks to that primal part of us that knows darkness equals danger, isolation equals vulnerability, and every step deeper is a step away from safety. The medieval man and the modern hiker are not so different. Both stand at the tree line, look into the shadows, and feel that whisper of unease, that instinct warning them that the forest is not theirs, that it never was, and that survival within it is always a negotiation with forces far older and stronger than us. So what do we take from this long walk into darkness, from the stories of peasants hanged for picking firewood, travelers butchered by bandits, soldiers skewered in pits, wanderers poisoned by streams, witches whispered about in clearings, and exhausted men collapsing in circles of fear? What does the medieval forest really teach us? At first glance it seems like a relic of a harsher past, a reminder that people once lived in constant danger we have since escaped. But if we strip away the layers of time, the forest still speaks to us, because it is not only about trees and shadows, but about the human condition itself. The medieval forest was a mirror of fragility, showing people how easily order collapses once you leave the walls of the village, how survival demands more than courage, how the environment itself is not hostile because it chooses to be, but because it simply does not care, and that indifference was perhaps the most terrifying truth of all. The laws that killed peasants for gathering berries remind us that human systems can be as cruel as any wolf. The bandits that thrived in hiding show us that desperation breeds predators among our own kind. The traps and battlefields hidden in the woods prove that war poisons the land long after the banners fall, and the superstitions about witches and demons illustrate how fear of the unknown shapes behavior as powerfully as hunger or thirst. These lessons do not fade with time, because they are the same truths that guide survival in every hostile place, whether in jungles, deserts, mountains, or even in the artificial forests of our modern world economic systems, political landscapes, digital spaces where the rules are unclear, the dangers are hidden, and survival requires caution, humility, and awareness. What medieval people understood, and what we too often forget, is that the forest is not inherently evil or benevolent. It simply is. And stepping into it without preparation is a wager against forces that will not bend for you. This is why the forest has remained in our stories as a symbol for trial and transformation. Why heroes in myths and fairy tales must pass through it before they can claim wisdom or victory. Because the forest represents the unknown that tests us, strips us down, and forces us to confront our limits. Medieval people feared it, we romanticize it, but at its core, the message is the same. Beyond the edge of safety lies risk, and risk is what shapes us. And perhaps the true horror is not that the forest kills, but that it does so without noticing, without malice, without memory, as indifferent as time itself, reminding us that in the grand scheme we are small, fragile, and fleeting. And only by respecting that truth can we hope to endure. And so we reach the final clearing in this long and unsettling journey. And if there is one lesson the medieval forest leaves behind, it is this: survival is not just about strength, nor courage, nor even faith. It is about humility, awareness, and respect for the forces we cannot control. For the people of the Middle Ages, the forest was the embodiment of that truth. A vast and indifferent judge that punished arrogance, swallowed the unprepared, and tested the desperate. And while our world has changed, the principle has not. Today, our forests may seem smaller, our tools more advanced, our knowledge greater. Yet still people vanish in the wilderness. Still fear grips us when we hear strange sounds in the dark. Still we tell stories of haunted woods and unseen predators. Because deep down the human mind has not changed, and the old fears are never fully erased. Perhaps this is why the forest remains such a powerful metaphor in our culture, because it symbolizes the unknown challenges we all must face, whether they are external dangers or internal struggles, reminding us that comfort and safety are temporary, that the line between order and chaos is thin, and that when we cross into uncertainty, the rules we rely on no longer apply. For medieval peasants, the forest was a trial of survival. For us, it might be an illness, a crisis, a loss, or a moment of fear that strips us down to our rawest self. But the lesson is the same. We cannot control everything, but we can prepare. We can endure, and we can learn to respect the limits of our strength. The medieval forest shows us not only how terrifying the world can be, but also how resilient people can become when they face that terror, because even in those hostile woods, some survived, some returned, and their stories remind us that fear does not only destroy, it also teaches, shapes, and transforms. So the takeaway is clear: whether we step into a literal forest or the metaphorical one life will inevitably place before us, survival depends less on denying fear and more on acknowledging it, respecting it, and moving forward despite it. Because only by doing so do we emerge changed, stronger, and wiser than before.